most unique American right after the right to life is the right to be left alone. Thus, the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says government agents cannot write their own search warrants, cannot knock on your door, cannot break it down, cannot arrest you, cannot take your property, cannot look at your personal papers unless they present real evidence of a real crime to a judge and a judge signs a warrant authorizing them to do so. That was the law until President Bush and a Republican Congress passed the Patriot Act. Democrats who once fought against the Patriot Act are now preparing to renew some of the most controversial provisions of this criminal piece of legislation. My next guest is an expert on martial law and on the emergence of a centralized police state. Dr. Edwin Vieira is a constitutional law expert, a professor, and a contributor to News with Views. His latest book is, get this, How to Dethrone the Imperial Judiciary. Dr. Vieira, welcome to Freedom Watch.
My pleasure to be with you.
Is it likely, I realize this is a political question, but is it likely that many of the Democrats who opposed the Patriot Act when it was proposed by a Republican president and forced upon them by a Republican Congress will now go along with the extension of it simply because the Democrat in the White House, who also himself once opposed it, is now in favor of it?
I should hope not, but the political reality seems to be that that's the way party politics in this country works. The Constitution is set at a much lower level than the demands of political loyalty within the parties.
Notwithstanding the oath to uphold the Constitution.
Notwithstanding that oath with respect to essentially everything that goes on under the Constitution.
Has the government enacted any legislation that you're aware of which would purport to give itself extraordinary and even unconstitutional powers in the case of an emergency? For example, could the president declare an economic emergency or a medical emergency and claim powers not authorized in the Constitution?
Well, I think we can go back all the way to the early 1930s to find examples of that are still in the law. I mean, the one that comes to mind now, given the economic crisis that we're going through, is in Title 12 of the United States Code, Section 95A, I believe it is, that gives the Secretary of the Treasury, with the consent of the President, which is essentially giving the power to the President, the power to become an economic dictator over the entire banking system. Given the centrality of the banking system in this free market economy to essentially everything that goes on in commerce and economics, that essentially gives the executive branch the power to be, in the truest sense of the word, an economic czar. They seem to like that word, but there's an example of it right from the 1930s. So we don't have to look at something like the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, or a whole series of these executive orders that have been enacted over the past few decades to find an extraordinary example of the problem that you're proposing.
The cynic in me causes me to ask, wouldn't the Federal Reserve be able to stop the president from doing that? Because he's essentially taking that power away from them.
Well, if you mean would they try to exercise behind the screen political influence on him, I suppose the answer is yes, but nonetheless the statute is there. And in fact, in the episode in the 1930s, it was the people in the Federal Reserve System, banking system in general, that tried to get Hoover to take that kind of action, eventually succeeded with Roosevelt. They were behind it, not against it.
What are the circumstances under which the president would claim the power to be able to put troops in the streets? Or worse yet, what are the circumstances under which the law could be read to authorize the military to direct civilians?
Well, I don't think that the law can be authorized, that law in particular can be authorized to direct the military to take some kind of control over civilians.
When you say that law, you mean the law that let FDR control all the banks?
Which is still there. I mean, imagine a situation where we have a grave breakdown of the banking system so that all commerce essentially is in chaos, and you can imagine the social ramifications that would follow from that. And they attempt to use that as an emergency situation justifying the imposition of martial law. The basic principle, constitutionally at least in martial law, is that it cannot be imposed while the courts remain open.
Right.
Not necessarily that the economy is not functioning well, but while the courts remain open. So it's very difficult to imagine a situation, unless you had some kind of nuclear strike or you had a pandemic that was killing millions of people, including judges and jurors and so forth, that the courts would not remain open, no matter how serious social dislocation might otherwise be.
Unless, of course, the same power that wanted to exercise martial law used the martial law to close the courts.
Well, of course,
to
that's
keep them
the
from
vicious
opening.
circle, isn't it? Where would they have the authority? If the authority depends upon circumstances that close the courts, they can't be the source of those circumstances.
Absolutely, absolutely. What about a flu pandemic? I mean, what powers would the government claim that it could exercise if the swine flu infects tens of millions of people this fall?
Well, of course, you have traditionally in this country the powers of government to quarantine people, to restrain the spread of an epidemic. Because I think a lot of people are less concerned about that than they are with the forced imposition of vaccinations, inoculations of one kind or another, because of the great dangers that people see in these untested new vaccines, and the possibility that the vaccines will actually result in more damage and more deaths than would otherwise have come from the disease itself.
I was reading a piece of legislation from the People's Republic of Massachusetts, right, which I don't think has been passed by the state Senate and thus has not yet been become law, but as enacted by their lower house would actually give the police the authority to enter your home against your will and to inoculate you and your children against your will. Could such a statute possibly be enacted and upheld by the courts?
Well, it's one house away and the signature of the governor, as I understand it, from being enacted, so the possibility of that is certainly true. Given the courts in Massachusetts, I don't think that they would necessarily shrink from upholding that. Of course, the ultimate question is whether that kind of forced medical treatment, especially given the nature of these vaccines, could possibly be constitutional. I mean, given the fact that quarantine would certainly result in limiting the spread of swine flu, I can't imagine how one would argue that the necessity for forced inoculations. I mean, that statute goes even further. I mean, they can imprison people. They can impose crippling fines on them. I mean, it's some kind of draconian Stalinist legislation. It's unbelievable. Now, but that's Massachusetts for.
We have at least two Supreme Court opinions of which I'm aware, which basically say that a competent adult can reject life-saving medicine and choose to die. Wouldn't such legislation, which would let the police break down your door and stick a needle in your arm against your will and take your kids and stick needles in their arms, go against what is already the law of the land?
Well, I think that would be true in the first step, at least, because the difficulty with this situation is a contagious disease we're talking about, pandemic potential, whereas most of those other situations involve life-threatening situation that reaches the individual solely. And then, of course, there's the other question on which they try to, or the other peg on which they try to hang the hat of power, which is protecting the children. Are the parents going to be allowed to make that determination for the minor child, right?
They always love to use the protection of children as an argument to take away freedom from adults. Before I let you go, how serious, I'm thinking of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, how serious is the threat of police breaking down your door and forcing medications on you in America in 2009?
Well, maybe not in 2009, into 2010. The very fact that they are proposing this, the very fact that they are passing statutes, at least in Massachusetts, that have these provisions in them, should alert us that the danger is extreme. They wouldn't be putting these institutions, these mechanisms in place unless someone planned to use them under some circumstances.
Dr. Edwin Vieira, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Judge Maltano.